You ever hear a story that sounds so simple you think you know how it ends? A girl, a bad deal, a long road home. Well, this ain't that story, because sometimes the road home isn't on any map, and sometimes the devil you know is a whole lot better than the angel who sold you. This all went down in the New Mexico Territory, 1881. The land was baked hard, and the wind blew red dust that got into your teeth, your soul. For a girl named Carol, the only shelter she'd ever known was the whitewashed chapel on the edge of town, where her father preached fire and brimstone every Sunday. She was a good daughter, modest, quiet. She kept her chin down and her prayers up, just like he taught her. She thought her father walked with God. She was wrong. She found out how wrong one afternoon. Tidying the altar, she heard voices from the vestry, her father's and another man's. A greasy, satisfied voice that belonged to a man named Clyde Hargan, a man with cold eyes and a silver belt buckle that seemed to suck the light right out of the room. "I don't have gold, Bon," her father was saying, his preacher's voice all low and reverent. "But I have a daughter." A heavy silence hung in the air, thick with the smell of incense and betrayal. Then Clyde's voice dripped through the quiet. "I will treat her like something precious," he said, "so long as she learns her place." Carol's breath hitched. The hymn book in her hands felt like a block of ice. She stepped into the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "What does that mean?" Both men spun around. Her father's face was a twisted mask of shame and fury. But Clyde just smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He tipped his hat, slow and easy. "I heard you," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She wasn't looking at Clyde. She was looking at the man who was supposed to protect her. "You're selling me." "Do not speak in that tone," her father hissed, taking a step toward her. "Is it unholy to ask for the truth?" she shot back. "Or just inconvenient?" The slap was so loud it echoed off the stone walls. It snapped her head back, and the sting on her cheek was nothing compared to the shattering of her world. Her father didn't look sorry. He looked righteous. "Suffering," he said, his voice cold as a tombstone, "is the cost of salvation. You will do your duty." That night they came for her, two of Clyde's men, with faces like rocks and eyes that saw her as cargo. She wore her Sunday dress and carried nothing. Her father didn't even say goodbye. He just watched from the doorway as they led her to a carriage, his silhouette framed against the lamplight like a ghost. The wheels turned, and the town she knew disappeared into the dusty dark. She was property now. Her life was over, or so she thought. The carriage rattled on for hours, a wooden cage taking her to a life she couldn't imagine. The desert stretched out on all sides, endless and empty under a sliver of moon. The driver was a hunched shape in the dark, and one of Clyde's men sat across from her, his gun resting on his lap. He hadn't said a word, just watched her. The panic that had been simmering in her chest began to boil over. Her hands clenched into fists. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. This couldn't be it. It couldn't end like this. She wasn't a lamb for the slaughter. With a scream that was more animal than human, she threw herself at the door, ramming it with her shoulder. The wood splintered. The man across from her lurched, surprised, his hand going for his gun. But he was too slow. She shoved the door open and launched herself into the night. The ground came up to meet her with brutal force. Gravel tore at her dress, her skin. She rolled, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Dust filled her mouth, her eyes. Pain was a hot fire racing along her arms and back. For a second she thought she heard the carriage slowing, a man shouting. But it didn't stop. It just kept going, disappearing into the darkness. They hadn't even thought she was worth chasing. She pushed herself up, staggering to her feet. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. Her ankle screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She scrambled away from the road into the jagged shadows of the hills, where the twisted trees looked like skeletons reaching for the sky. She had no plan, no food, no water, just a burning need to run. But as she stumbled deeper into the wilderness, she couldn't shake a terrifying thought. Maybe they didn't chase her because they knew. They knew the desert would finish the job for them. The desert is a patient killer. It doesn't rush. It saps your strength, cracks your lips, and fills your head with whispers. Carol ran until her legs were numb. Then she walked until her feet were raw. The cold of the night seeped into her bones. She didn't remember falling. One moment she was moving, putting one foot in front of the other, and the next the world just stopped. She sank into the gravel, into the silence, into a place between living and dying. She was too exhausted to feel fear, too dehydrated to cry. Her last thought was of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, humming a strange, sad song in a language she didn't understand. That year, a rare snow fell on the high ridges, a thin white blanket over the bones of the earth. And that's where he found her. His name was Chaza. He moved like a shadow, silent on the frosted ground, tracking a deer with a bow in his hand. But what he saw stopped him cold. A splash of color against the gray rock. A crumpled shape that was clearly not an animal. He approached slowly, his eyes missing nothing. A girl, young, her dress torn and stained with blood and dirt. Her skin was flushed with fever, but cold to the touch. Her lips were cracked, her eyelashes stiff with frost. She was knocking on death's door. He should have left her. An outsider was trouble. A white girl found like this? It was a danger he didn't need. He was about to turn away, to leave her for the coyotes and the crows. But then he saw it. Hanging around her neck on a worn leather cord was a small bundle of feathers, two black, one white, and one faded crimson, tied together with a very specific knot. A knot he hadn't seen since he was a child. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any token. It was a sign from the old ways, a sacred bundle carried by those born of the people, but lost to the white man's world. It meant one who may return. It was a whisper of a promise, a key to a door long thought locked. He didn't know how she had it. He didn't care. The sign was clear. You don't leave family to die in the snow. He lifted her into his arms. She was as light as a bundle of dry sticks. He carried her back toward his village, nestled in a hidden valley, a place that didn't exist on any white man's map. He knew what he was doing was a risk. Bringing her in could bring soldiers, could bring disease, could bring war. But leaving her would be a betrayal to the spirits themselves. He didn't take her to the war chief or the council. He took her straight to Nakama. The old woman sat by her fire, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her gray hair braided with thistle and bone. She was the village's wisdom keeper, and her eyes saw things others missed. She looked up as Chaza entered, her gaze sharp and questioning. "She is marked," he said in their tongue, laying Carol gently on a bed of woven mats. Nakoma leaned forward, her old fingers gently touching the feather token. She studied the knot, the age of the feathers. Her expression was unreadable. Then she looked at Chaza, and a flicker of something ancient and sad passed through her eyes. She nodded once. "The earth brings back what was taken," she whispered. Carol woke up to the smell of cedar smoke. The first thing she felt was warmth. A thick buffalo hide was pulled over her, and a small fire crackled nearby, chasing the chill from her bones. Her throat was sandpaper. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. A carved wooden bowl was lifted to her lips, and she drank the cool water greedily. When her vision cleared, she saw the old woman watching her. Her eyes were like dark river stones, patient and knowing. "Rest," Nakoma said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The wind will wait." Days blurred into a haze of sleep, bitter tea, and strange-tasting broth. Her strength returned in small, precious drops. When she could finally sit up, she saw the feather token lying beside her. She picked it up, the leather soft and familiar against her fingers. She looked at Nakoma. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice still raw. "She gave it to me before she died. She never told me what it meant." Nakoma's gaze was steady. Words are not always needed. A wave of desperation washed over Carol. She was alive, she was warm, but she was trapped. She had nowhere to go. Back to her father was impossible. Back to Clyde was a death sentence. The wilderness would surely kill her. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have nowhere else. I'll do anything to stay. I'll work. I'll give myself if that's what it costs." She lowered her eyes, shame burning in her cheeks. She was trading one cage for another, but at least this one felt warm. A floorboard creaked behind her. She hadn't heard anyone enter. Chaza stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. He had heard every word. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers. They weren't angry or lustful or even pitiful. They were just clear, like looking into a deep, cold well. "This is not a place where bodies are traded for belonging," he said, his voice low and calm, but with an edge of steel that cut right through her shame. "You will work, you will learn, you will heal. Here, gratitude is not measured in flesh." He held her gaze for a beat longer, then turned and disappeared back into the night, leaving Carol stunned and speechless. She looked from the empty doorway to the feather token in her hand, a profound and terrifying hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Outside, the last of the snow was melting under the first real sun in days, but the thaw inside her was just beginning, and she had no idea if it would save her or drown her. The village was a world of smoke, leather, and rhythms she didn't understand. Her new life began not with a welcome, but with a test. Nakoma put a grinding stone in her hands and a pile of dried corn. Work was all she said. Carol's hands, soft from hymns and prayers, were soon blistered and raw. Her back ached. Her eyes watered from the smoke of the central fire. But she didn't complain. She ground the corn until her shoulders screamed, swept the ash from the fire pit, fetched water from the icy stream, and scrubbed pots with sand until her knuckles bled. She was an outcast, a ghost moving at the edge of their lives. The other women watched her with narrowed, suspicious eyes. The children would stop their games and stare as she passed. The warriors ignored her completely. They saw her white skin, her strange dress, and saw an enemy, an omen, trouble waiting to happen. She was alone, more alone than she had ever been in the desert. Chaza was a constant, silent presence. He moved through the village like a predator, always watching, always aware. He never spoke to her, but she felt his eyes on her. Sometimes she would wake in the cold of the night to find an extra blanket laid over her. The water bucket near Nakoma's lodge would be full before dawn, a task she knew was his. He was a shadow, offering help she couldn't ask for, and protection she didn't understand. Why was he helping her? What did he see when he looked at her? Nakoma's lessons were harsh, taught in silence and gestures. How to stitch buckskin with a bone needle. How to read the clouds for rain. How to find the bitter root that would cure a fever. One afternoon, while they were sorting dried herbs, Nakoma began to hum. It was a strange, haunting melody, and it sent a shiver down Carol's spine. It was the song from her dreams, her mother's song. "My mother," Carol whispered, her hands stilling. "She used to hum that." Nakoma stopped humming. Her eyes, usually so calm, sharpened with an intensity that startled Carol. "What was her name?" "Carol," she answered automatically. "No, wait. That was what my father called her. Her real name, Amara." The old woman went rigid. "She had a scar," Carol added, a forgotten memory bubbling to the surface, behind her left ear, from falling off a pony when she was a child. Nakoma reached out and with a trembling finger traced the spot behind Carol's own ear. Her breath came out in a long, shuddering sigh. "She was Little Sparrow," Nakoma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A daughter of our people, taken by raiders during a hard winter more than 20 years ago. We thought she was dead." The world tilted on its axis. The herbs fell from Carol's lap. Her mother, the quiet, sad woman who always seemed to be looking at a distant horizon, was one of them. "She never told me," Carol breathed, the words catching in her throat. "She just gave me the feathers and said, 'Someday this will guide you home.'" "She did not forget," Nakoma said, her voice fierce. "She waited for the world to remember her. The revelation should have been a bridge. Instead, it became a wall." The whispers that had followed Carol before now grew louder, sharper. If her mother was one of them, why had she stayed with a white man? Why had she never tried to return? To some, the story made Carol an object of pity. To others, she was the living symbol of a great betrayal. The daughter of a woman who had abandoned her people. The sabotage started small. Ashes in the water pot, the sinew thread she used for mending, sliced through. But then it escalated. She was sent to gather firewood near a place known for rattlesnakes. A pot of stew she'd spent all day preparing was mysteriously knocked over, spoiling the evening meal for 3 families. The accidents were always subtle, always deniable. No one ever saw anything, but she felt the hatred, a cold, sharp thing pointed at her back. One warrior in particular, a man named Kono, made his contempt clear. His face was scarred, his eyes full of a hard, bitter light. He had lost his own family in a raid by white soldiers years ago. He saw Carol and saw only ghosts. He would stand near her, sharpening his knife, the scrape of steel on stone a clear threat. He never spoke to her, but his message was understood. You are not welcome here. One night, the weight of it all became too much. The loneliness, the fear, the endless work, the hostile glares. She huddled in the dark of Nakoma's lodge. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and she cried. Silent, hiccuping sobs of a grief so deep it felt like it was hollowing her out. She had survived her father, survived Clyde, survived the desert. But she wasn't sure she could survive this crushing, silent rejection. A shadow fell across the entrance. Chaza stepped inside, silent as the night itself. He didn't speak. He just came and crouched by the dying fire. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small deerskin bundle, tied with sinew. He held it out to her. Her hands trembled as she took it. It was unexpectedly heavy. She slowly unwrapped the ties. Inside was not a gift of beads or food. It was a knife. The handle was carved from the antler of a great elk, smooth and pale. The blade was dark, forged steel, sharp enough to split a hair. It was a warrior's knife, a man's knife. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion. Tears still tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. Why? She whispered. Chaza finally met her gaze. He reached out, not to touch her, but to point with his chin at the knife in her hands. In our world, he said, his voice a low rumble, we do not cry. We do not wait for others to protect us. We fight. He paused, his eyes boring into hers. That was your mother's mistake. It will not be yours. He stood, turned, and left as silently as he had arrived. Carol stared at the knife. It wasn't a gift of kindness. It wasn't a promise of protection. It was a challenge. And as her fingers curled around the carved antler handle, she felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, but for the first time, it had a sharp edge. The knife changed everything. It wasn't a weapon she brandished. It was a truth she carried. The weight of it at her belt was a constant reminder of Chasa's words. We fight. She stopped flinching when Kono stared at her. She met his gaze, her hand resting near the antler handle. Her fear was hardening into something else. Resolve. Her work became her fight. She learned faster, pushed harder. Nakoma showed her which plants could be made into poison for an arrow tip and which could be made into a poultice to draw out infection. Carol memorized them all. She learned to set snares, to read tracks, to skin a rabbit with the knife Chaza had given her. She was no warrior, but she would not be a victim. The village began to notice, not with acceptance, but with a grudging respect. The woman did not break. Her biggest fight, however, wasn't with Kono, but with the language. It was a wall between her and the people, so she decided to tear it down, one word at a time. She started with the children. They were curious, less guarded than their parents. She would sit with them, using her knife to draw pictures in the dirt. A sun, a tree, a horse. She would say the word in English, and they would shout the word back in their tongue, giggling at her clumsy pronunciation. Soon it became a daily ritual. The children were her teachers. Ta, they would say, pointing to the sun. So, pointing to a tree. And she would repeat the words over and over until the strange sounds felt natural on her tongue. The mothers watched from a distance, their expressions softening just a little. She was not trying to change their children. She was letting their children change her. One afternoon, that bridge she was building was tested by fire, or rather, by water. A sudden spring storm had turned the gentle stream at the edge of the village into a raging, muddy torrent. Shouts of alarm rose from the riverbank. A little boy, one of her most eager students, had slipped on a mossy rock and been swept into the current. His small head bobbed in the churning water, his arms flailing wildly. The warriors were running toward the river, but they were too far away. The boy's mother stood frozen, screaming his name. Carol didn't think. She just ran. She hit the icy water with a gasp, the force of it nearly knocking her off her feet. The current was a monster, pulling and tearing at her. She fought it, her eyes locked on the boy. She lunged, her fingers just managing to snag the back of his tunic as he went under. She pulled with all her might, the water dragging them both downstream. Her lungs were burning. Her limbs felt like lead. For a terrifying second, she thought they were both going to be lost, but her feet found purchase on a submerged rock. She heaved, dragging the sputtering, coughing boy toward the bank. They collapsed onto the mud, gasping for air, as the entire village gathered around them. No one cheered. No one said a word. They just stared. Kono was there, his face unreadable. The boy's mother rushed forward, snatching her child into her arms, checking him for injuries before turning to look at Carol, her eyes wide with a dawning, shocked gratitude. Then slowly the crowd dispersed, returning to their lodges as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. That night, a small clay bowl filled with ripe, sweet berries was left outside Nakoma's lodge. The next morning, the boy's mother came and silently handed Carol a shawl, woven from soft wool and dyed with intricate patterns. There was no thank you. There didn't need to be. The whispers about her didn't stop, but their tone began to change. The wall of suspicion had a crack in it, and through that crack, a little light was starting to shine. Even Kono's glare seemed to have lost some of its heat, but Chaza remained a mystery. He watched her still, his silence a heavy blanket she couldn't see beneath. She had passed his test. She had learned to fight, but she still had no idea if she had won. The quiet truce she had earned was shattered one evening near dusk. The sky was painted in bleeding shades of pink and orange. Carol was outside, grinding dried corn, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her hand instinctively going to her knife. It was Chausa. He stood over her, his expression as impassive as ever. But in his hand, he held a small bundle wrapped in worn buckskin. He held it out to her, saying nothing. His silence was more unnerving than Kono's threats. She wiped the cornmeal from her hands and took the bundle. It was light. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He just watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes. With hesitant fingers, she unwrapped the buckskin. Inside lay a bracelet. It wasn't made of beads or silver. It was woven from strands of horsehair, black as night and red as clay, braided together with incredible skill. In the center was a single flat piece of polished bone. Etched into the bone was a word, a name, Nita. She ran her thumb over the strange symbols, her heart beginning to pound. She had learned enough of the language to know some words, but not this one. "What does it mean?" For the first time, Chausa's voice held something other than cold command. It was low, almost gentle. "The one who begins again." The air left her lungs in a rush. Nita, not Carol, the preacher's daughter, not the runaway, not the outsider. Nita, a new person, a new beginning. Her throat tightened, and she looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, filled with firelight and the sound of their breathing. "Is that me?" she asked. He gave a single slow nod. His gaze held hers, and for the first time, she saw past the warrior's mask. She saw the man beneath, a man who had seen her not as a burden or a threat, but as someone worthy of a new name. "If I am the beginning," she whispered, the words feeling huge and fragile in the twilight air, "then you are where I begin." A flicker of something, surprise, emotion, crossed his face before the mask slammed back into place. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. And in that quiet moment, Carol understood. He hadn't just given her a name. He had given her a place to stand. But a new name can't protect you from an old debt, and hers was about to come due. The dusk came first, a plume on the horizon, rising against the morning sun. It meant riders, and riders always meant trouble. A lookout's cry echoed through the valley. Instantly, the peaceful rhythm of the village stopped. Children were snatched indoors. Women disappeared into the lodges. The warriors emerged, moving with a fluid, deadly grace, bows in hand, faces grim. They formed a silent line at the edge of the village. They had been betrayed before. They were always ready. Carol, Nita, stood frozen beside Nakoma's fire, her hands still coated in cornmeal. Her blood ran cold. She knew. Before she even saw the glint of the sun on a silver belt buckle, she knew who it was. 5 riders crested the ridge. At their center was Clyde Hargan. He looked just the same, his face smug, his posture arrogant. He rode as if he owned the ground beneath his horse's hooves. He reined in just outside the line of warriors, his eyes sweeping over them with contempt. Then his gaze found her, and he smiled that same dead-eyed smile. "There she is," he called out, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "My runaway dove." Nita stepped forward, away from the safety of the lodge. Nakoma hissed her name, a warning, but she ignored it. Chaza, standing in the line of warriors, shifted his weight, his knuckles white on his bow. "I'm not yours," Nita said, her voice clear and steady. The girl who had trembled in the vestry was gone. Clyde's smirk widened. "I paid for you, girl. A contract's a contract. Your daddy saw to that. What you did after, running off like some wild animal, that's on you. But the fun's over. You're coming back." "You paid for silence," she shot back, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You paid for obedience. You didn't pay for me." Clyde's face darkened. This was not the timid girl he'd bought. He turned his angry gaze on the warriors. "You think this pathetic village can stand against the law?" He spat. "I've got a dozen more men waiting just over that ridge, men with rifles. You give her up now, or I swear to God, I'll burn this place to the ground and salt the earth." That's when Chaza moved. He didn't draw an arrow. He didn't shout a challenge. He just stepped out of the line and walked until he was standing between Nita and Clyde. He raised his spear, not to throw it, but to plant the butt firmly in the dirt, a line drawn in the sand. One by one, the other warriors stepped up beside him, a silent, unmovable wall of defiance. Clyde's horse shifted nervously. His men looked at each other, their bravado starting to crack. But Clyde wasn't a man who backed down. He had another card to play. "Your mother," he said, looking straight at Nita, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "Amara, did she ever tell you why she ran away from this paradise?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air like poison. "It wasn't raiders who took her, girl. She left. She stole something. Something that belongs to the people. Something they would kill to get back." A stunned silence fell over the village. Nita stared at him, her mind reeling. It was a lie. It had to be. But then she saw Nakoma's face. The old woman's eyes were wide with a flicker of something. Fear? Recognition? "She stole the winter count," Clyde said, his voice triumphant. "The painted hide that holds the history of your tribe. Every battle, every treaty, every sacred ceremony. It's your soul on a piece of leather. And your mother took it." He pointed a finger at Nita. "She told me where she hid it. And if you don't come with me right now, I'm going to tell the U.S. cavalry exactly where to find it. They'd pay a pretty penny for a map to your people's heart." The warriors stirred, their whispers a low, angry buzz. They looked from Clyde to Nita, and then to Nakoma. The trust she had bled for, the acceptance she had earned, was evaporating like mist in the sun. She was the daughter of a traitor, the bearer of a curse. Kono stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. He pointed his spear not at Clyde, but at Nita. "Is this true, old mother?" he demanded of Nakoma. "Did Little Sparrow betray us?" Nakoma's face was ashen. She wouldn't meet Nita's desperate gaze. The world was collapsing, and the only person who could save her was a silent warrior who had named her, and an old woman who now looked at her as if she were a snake. Clyde laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He had won. He knew it. "The girl comes with me," he declared, "or your history goes up in smoke." But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He thought Chaza's loyalty was to the tribe's past. He was wrong. It was to its future. And that future was standing right behind him. The world held its breath. The warriors looked to Nakoma for a sign, their hands tight on their weapons. Kono's spear was still pointed at Nita, his face torn between hatred for the outsider and fury at the man threatening his people. Clyde sat on his horse, confident, victorious. He had them trapped. Nita's mind raced. Her mother, a thief? The woman whose memory she cherished? A traitor? It couldn't be true. But the doubt was a poison, spreading through the faces of the people around her. She looked at Nakoma, pleading with her eyes. The old woman just stared at the ground, her silence a confession. Then Chaza spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a razor. "The story is not yours to tell," he said, his eyes locked on Clyde. Clyde scoffed. "I hold the cards, boy. The girl or the map. Make your choice." "There is no choice," Chaza said. He took one step forward, then another, closing the distance until he stood right beside Nita. He didn't look at her, but she felt the solid strength of him, an anchor in the storm. "Nita does not leave," Kono snarled. "She is the daughter of a traitor. Her blood is poison." "Her blood is the blood of the people," Chaza shot back, his voice ringing with authority. "And her heart is stronger than you know." He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally meeting Nita's. There was no doubt in his eyes, only a fierce, unwavering belief. "The past is ash. We live for the fire to come." It was a declaration, a challenge to them all. He was choosing her, over their laws, over their history, over their fear. That's when Nakoma finally looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears, but also with a sudden, blazing fire. She walked forward, her old body straight and proud, until she stood before them all. "He is right," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "Little Sparrow was my daughter's dearest friend. She did not steal the winter count, she saved it." A gasp went through the crowd. "The winter she disappeared," Nakoma continued. "Our old chief was dying. His son was weak, easily swayed by the whispers of traitors who promised riches for our land. He was going to sell the winter count, sell our history for their whiskey and lies. Little Sparrow knew this, so she took it. She fled into the night, not to betray us, but to protect us, to hide our soul until a time of true leadership returned." She turned her burning gaze on Clyde. She trusted the wrong white man, a man who promised her protection, but instead kept her a prisoner, trying to torture the location of the hide from her. She died protecting our secret. She died a hero. Clyde's face went pale. The story was unraveling, his power slipping away. Nakoma pointed a bony finger at Nita. "Her daughter has returned. The blood of a hero is with us again. She carries her mother's fire." The truth of it hit them like a thunderclap. The warriors lowered their weapons. Kono stared at Nita, the hatred in his eyes replaced by a stunned confusion. Clyde saw he had lost. In a panic, he pulled his pistol. "I don't care about your stories," he screamed, aiming the gun not at Chasa, but at Nita. "She's still mine." He never fired the shot. An arrow, swift and silent as a ghost, sprouted from his shoulder. He cried out, dropping the gun as he slumped forward in his saddle. Chasa stood with his bow still raised, his face a mask of cold fury. Clyde's men, seeing their leader fall, didn't wait around. They wheeled their horses and fled, disappearing over the ridge as fast as they had come. Clyde, clutching his shoulder, managed to stay on his horse, glaring back with pure hatred before galloping after them. The threat was gone, but the echoes of it remained. Nita stood in the silence, her head spinning. Her mother wasn't a traitor. She was a hero, and these people, they were truly her people. Chaza lowered his bow and came to her side. He gently took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. He looked at Kono, who still stood, spear in hand, his face a mess of shame and awe. "She is Nita," Chaza said, his voice firm. "The one who begins again. She is one of us." Kono looked at Nita, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not a white woman, but the daughter of a woman who had sacrificed everything for them. He drove the butt of his spear into the ground, the same gesture of solidarity Chaza had made, and bowed his head. One by one, the other warriors did the same, a silent, powerful salute. Nita looked at the faces around her, faces that had once held suspicion and hatred, and now held respect. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time, They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of belonging. She was home. The day of the naming ceremony was clear and bright. The entire village gathered in a circle, the sacred fire burning in the center, its smoke rising straight into the blue sky. Nita stood beside Chaza, no longer an outsider waiting for acceptance, but a part of the circle itself. She wore a tunic of soft doe skin, embroidered by the women with symbols of fire and new beginnings. Around her neck was her mother's feather token. Around her wrist was the horsehair bracelet Chaza had made her. Nakoma stepped forward, holding a ceremonial shawl dyed the color of the earth in the sunset. Today, she proclaimed, her voice carrying over the crowd, we do not give a name. We welcome one home. A name that was lost in the long winter has returned to us with the spring. She faced Nita, her eyes shining. Your mother was Little Sparrow, but you have flown through darkness and fire. You have your mother's courage, but your own strength. You are Nita Asa, she said, her voice full of emotion. The new fire. She draped the shawl over Nita's shoulders. A murmur of approval went through the circle. The little boy she had pulled from the river ran forward and shyly handed her a perfectly shaped, smooth white stone. She knelt and accepted it, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. That night there was a celebration. Drums echoed through the valley, and the people danced in the flickering firelight. Nita danced with them, her steps no longer hesitant, but sure and strong. She moved between the worlds she had come from, the hesitant grace of Carol blending with the fierce rhythm of Nita Asa. Later, when the dancing slowed and the moon climbed high in the sky, she and Chaza stood alone by the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on his strong face. He had been quiet all evening, watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. You are a fire, he said, his voice a low rumble. You burned away the lies. You gave me the spark, she whispered, looking up at him. He reached out and gently touched the feather token at her neck. Your mother left a path for you to follow. Then his gaze met hers, and she saw in his eyes everything he never said aloud. The respect, the admiration, the deep, unshakable connection that had been forged between them in suspicion, in danger, and finally in truth. Nita, he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. My fire. He closed the small distance between them. There were no vows spoken, no grand pronouncements. There was only the quiet gravity of two souls who had found each other across an impossible divide. His hand rested on her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin, and he leaned in. In the warmth of the sacred fire, under a sky full of stars that had seen all the stories that had ever been, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of possession, but of recognition, a promise, a beginning. She was not the preacher's daughter, sold for silence. She was not the runaway, lost in the desert. She was Nita Asa, the new fire of the Comanche, and with Chaza by her side, her flame would never be extinguished. She was home, not in a place but in a people, in a heart, and her story, the true story, was just beginning. If you were captivated by Nita's fight for belonging and Chaza's unwavering belief, you found your tribe. Stories like this, where courage is forged in fire and love is the ultimate act of defiance, are what we live for. Don't be an outsider. Hit that subscribe button and join our circle. We've got countless more tales from the untamed heart of the wild, where legends aren't born, they're made. Ring that notification bell, because your next great adventure is waiting just around the bend. You won't want to miss it.